Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. My name is Alfredo Villavicencio. For those who don't know me, I'm an evaluation specialist at the Climate Investment Funds, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this sixth session of the Transformational Change Learning Partnership working sessions. Today, we will focus on signals as a tool, evaluating transformational change in CIF's resilience program in particular. This is in the context that CIF has commissioned an independent evaluation of its pilot program for climate resilience, or the PPCR program, to assess and learn from its resilience building investments. And this study will also assess the extent to which PPCR has been transformational in delivering climate finance interventions. The discussion today will be built around the transformational change framework in a way, and I'm confident that the team from ICF will give you more insights about it. So I will not get into the details, but we're definitely delighted to have first Jess Kyle. She is an expert in global program evaluation design, implementation, and management, with a focus on climate change, environment, and international development programs. She's currently as well leading this evaluation with ICF. And we also have Dr. Laura Cole. She's an associate professor of public policy and urban affairs and international affairs at Northeastern University in Boston. So without further ado, Jess, Laura, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Alfredo, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a CIF learning event focused on the use of signals of transformational change as an evaluation tool. So this learning event is part of the CIF's ongoing effort through its TCLP to innovate and develop new concepts and methods for evaluating transformational change. This event is also serving a practical purpose for us, which is to inform an ongoing evaluation, as Alfredo said, of the CIF's resilience program, its pilot program for climate resilience. As Alfredo said, I'm Jessica Kyle. I'm the team leader for ICF that's leading this evaluation, and I'm joined today by Dr. Laura Cole, whose scholarship focuses on transformational adaptation and resilience. Next slide. Just a few technical reminders before we get started. This meeting is being recorded. You may have seen the notification. Please do mute your microphone when you're not speaking. If you could raise your virtual hand, we will call on you. And if you can allow everyone the chance to speak and listen, that would be wonderful. You can put anything in the chat if you have any issues, and we'll try to resolve them for you. Next slide. Okay. So just a brief overview of our agenda for today. We are welcoming you now. We're going to go over our objectives in just a minute. The first part of this learning event is going to be an introduction, a very brief introduction to the PPCR evaluation that we're conducting. And then we're going to go into this transformational change signals concept and the framework that we've developed for this evaluation. We're excited to share it with you, get your feedback on it. After that, we're going to do a brief exercise in a software program called Mural. We will walk you through it. We're going to ask you to be brainstorming some signals of transformational change, and we're going to work together as a group to try to map those to the signals framework. After we finish that, we're going to move to a plenary discussion. As I said, we're so thrilled to have the opportunity to get your feedback. We have put together this vision for transformational resilience building, and we'd love to hear from you. What have we missed? What can we change? How can we improve it so that we can robustly evaluate the CIF's contribution to transformational change? Next slide. Okay. Just to recap, our objective here is to collectively refine, or at least gather your feedback on this conceptual framework for signals of transformational change in climate resilient development. So really the question we're asking is, how can we strengthen and improve our vision of transformational resilience building so we can better evaluate is PPCR contributing to transformational change? We think this approach of signals could be adapted for a range of evaluative activities. It's not necessarily specific to PPCR. could be applied in contexts beyond the work of the CIF. And it also has an important sort of future value for the CIF. Transformational change is part of future CIF programs' integrated results framework. So figuring out how to evaluate it will be important. Next slide. Let me just briefly introduce this evaluation of the pilot program for climate resilience, the PPCR. This evaluation was commissioned by the CIF's Evaluation and Learning Initiative. It's actually the first summative evaluation for the CIF. We're trying to understand if PPCR has achieved its mandate. Part of that is understanding the extent to which PPCR has been transformational. Transformational change is part of the CIF founding mandate. Transformational impact is the highest level of the PPCR results framework. So understanding if PPCR has contributed to progress towards transformational change will be a key part of this evaluation. But in order to do that, we need to have a common understanding of what that would look like. What would it look like if transformational change relevant to climate resilience were happening? What would we be looking for? How will we know? And so that's the starting point for this work and also the impetus for this learning event. Next slide. So this community, this TCLP community of practice has done a ton of important work already on understanding and advancing and promoting transformational change and climate action. I'm just going to really briefly remind you of some of this conceptual basis in case we have any folks for whom these concepts are new in this virtual room. So just starting with a definition. So the TCLP over the years has developed this working definition of transformational change, which is fundamental change in systems relevant to climate action with large-scale positive impacts that shift and accelerate the trajectory of progress towards climate neutral, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable development pathways. Next slide. So the TCLP has also defined 5 dimensions of transformational change. These are attributes of change that all have to be attended to for transformation. So we have relevance, alignment and attentiveness to goals and context. We have systemic change, fundamental shifts in the way systems are structured and function, whether they're environmental, ecological systems, social systems, political systems, economic systems. Speed, which is about accelerating impact to achieve the right speed of change. Scale, which is about contextually large change processes and impacts. And adaptive sustainability, which is about robustness, resilience, adaptiveness of change. Next slide. This community has actually also been involved over the years in developing the idea of signals as a tool to evaluate progress towards transformational change. I mean, it's a well-known problem that we don't really know how to measure transformational change. So we need some new tools to help us. And signals are one methodological answer to this question that kept getting brought up in the TCLP. How will we know we're making progress towards transformational change? And so that's what signals are. They're changes that show progress towards transformational change, both within and across the dimensions. Next slide. I think it might be helpful to distinguish between signals conceptually and signals in terms of observing what's actually happening in a certain context. So as I mentioned, in order to evaluate whether transformational change is happening, we need to define the changes we would expect to see as transformational change advances or solidifies or deepens. And so this is the signals framework that we're going to share with you today, showing sort of our hypothesized signposts for what transformational change in climate resilient development could look like. We definitely recognize that it will be a complex, it will be a non-linear pathway towards transformation, but that we also need some signposts to help us understand, are we making progress? How do we tackle this practically? And so then there's also the practical work of actually looking for those signals. These will be evidence that change is happening in specific contexts. And here we're thinking about moving away from the outcomes or the impacts of a single intervention and really thinking about what are the broader changes we're observing at a higher level. For example, using a country as a unit of analysis. And so if we compare those actual changes that we observe with a conceptual framework, we'll be able to track progress towards transformational change, start to identify shortcomings or insights in those change processes. Next slide. Okay, so in the next set of slides, we're going to present this conceptual signals framework. They are presented by dimension of transformational change, so relevance, systemic change, speed, scale, adaptive sustainability. And again, these are the signals we would expect to see if this progress is happening. I just want to say before we get into them, we developed these on the basis of a number of different sources. We reviewed academic and gray literature on transformational adaptation and resilience. We referred to the CIF's own work. They've been developing guiding questions for transformational change for their new programs. We certainly relied on our team's own thinking and expertise, some of our past experience developing and using signals for a recent evaluation of the CIF's forest investment program. As we go through these conceptual signals, we're also going to try to share some real-world examples of potential signals that we've identified in the PPCR portfolio. We are quite early in this process, but we think maybe some real-world examples will help bring this down from sort of the clouds back down into reality. So I'm going to pause now. I'm going to turn over to Laura. She's going to talk us through relevance.
Sure. So the first dimension that we're going to start with is relevance. And this is a signal that, or a dimension of transformation that's important to consider across the whole sort of life cycle of an investment, but it's particularly relevant when thinking about the design phase of a project. And so here there's kind of a number of different signals. You'll see several of these signals are kind of relate to the other dimensions of change. And this is really because that relevance question is kind of setting the framework and scene for ensuring that those other dimensions will be attended to throughout the process. So I'm just going to walk quickly through these signals, and then I'm going to give a couple examples of some of the signals that we're seeing coming out of the portfolio so far. So the first is alignment with goals, priorities, and needs. And this is something that we can think about seeing signals at multiple scales. This could be at the global scale of alignment with global needs, all the way down to the national, or also at the local scale. Alignment with systems thinking is really critical to transformation. We know that we need to be able to identify those kind of specific interventions that are most likely to lead to transformation, and that requires thinking in a systems framework to identify leverage points, opportunities, as well as to be thinking ahead of time about potential trade-offs. The next signal is about designing for integrated systemic change. One of the things we know about transformation is that we're unlikely to achieve transformation if we're approaching things from a siloed perspective. And so really I'm looking for things to be addressed holistically, to be thinking about integrating ecological, social, and economic priorities and other dimensions of systemic change at the same time is going to be important for achieving that transformation. Signals of just transition are also really important for transformation. We want to ensure getting to that kind of part of the definition of transformation of that these are positive changes, that they're really going to be benefiting a wide number of people and having equitable impacts. And so this is really looking at both the process and the outcomes. Is the process through which transformation occurring inclusive, and also are the benefits accruing from that transformation distributed widely and equitably? Designing for ambition at scale is really thinking about the fact that we know that transformation is not something that necessarily happens automatically, and the more that we can be intentionally designing and planning for transformation, the more likely it is that that transformation will be occurring. And so this is thinking about the ambition early on to contribute to contextually large changes, as well as whether projects or investments are thinking about identifying pathways to scale. And then the last signal is really thinking about the fact that transformation is a long-term process. It's not necessarily something that's going to be achieved within the lifetime of a project. And so thinking about sustainability and resilience is really important to ensure that that transformation is going to occur. Next slide. So here, we just wanted to share a couple signals, examples that are coming out of the portfolio review. And as Jess said, we're still at kind of early stages of this analysis, but we thought it would be helpful to share some examples. And we're focusing in here just on the relevant signal of systemic thinking, to talk through some of the ways that what concretely are we looking for. So one of the things that is kind of an indication of systemic thinking, one of these examples is whether projects are reflecting at the design stage on root causes of vulnerabilities and inequalities. And one nice example of this is a project in Bangladesh that described the vulnerability, this is a climate vulnerability, and linked that to kind of underlying drivers of poor governance, low adaptive capacity, even things like low tax collection efficiency and outdated financial management practices. These aren't necessarily specific climate vulnerabilities, but they're linking these to the climate vulnerability. The next thing we have been looking for is identification of mitigation and adaptation synergies and trade-offs. This whole portfolio is an adaptation portfolio, so that's really the focus of the interventions, but we know that adaptation doesn't occur in a vacuum, and identifying early on the potential for synergies with mitigation is one of these indications of systemic thinking and opportunities for broader transformation that this portfolio could be helping contribute to, as well as the importance of thinking about potential trade-offs. And a project from Mozambique that was reflecting on some of the conservation activities that were being done for adaptation also acknowledged the climate mitigation benefits that those might have. From the literature, and increasingly we recognize that there's a real risk that adaptation projects, if poorly designed, could actually increase vulnerability. And so one of these signals of systemic thinking that we're looking for is have projects considered maladaptation, and is there evidence that there's strategies to mitigate maladaptation? One project in Zambia had a nice example of this. It was a project that one of the components was thinking about sort of participatory action projects. And although the details of those weren't included, one of the criteria that was discussed in detail was the importance of ensuring that those particular projects didn't contribute to maladaptation, or in other words, have short-term benefits, but increase vulnerability in the long term. As we talked about, this importance of ensuring that there's an intentionality around planning for transformation is really important at this stage. A project in Jamaica that's focusing on the fisheries sector has a nice example here. It reflects on how 5 years is too short to measure economic impacts, but the project activities were very intentional about setting the foundation for those long-term changes. And I think this is a nice example to show the types of activities that the project was thinking of as being transformational: effective organization, increased knowledge, adoption of climate smart practices, and increased capacity to diversify livelihoods. None of these on their own are necessarily signals of transformation, but in this context where there's an intentionality of understanding how they would contribute to long-term transformation, we see this as a signal. And then the last example that I'll just mention here is the inclusion of adaptive management features, recognizing that transformation processes are inherently unpredictable, and there's a need to be able to respond to those. A project in Rwanda included a contingency emergency response component that would allow for the rapid reallocation of project funds in the event of a crisis. And this was a feature that's included in several of the projects in the portfolio. And this institutionalization of kind of adaptive management mechanisms is one example of this. And so this is just kind of a very high level, rapid overview of a couple of practical examples, but we look forward to exploring more examples with you later in the presentation. I'll hand it back to Jess.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. We are going to throw a lot at you right now and try to leave plenty of time at the end for this exercise and for some discussion. And I see a little bit of action in the chat too. So thanks very much to Scott for clarifying this difference between signals and traditional indicators. That's an important distinction. I'm going to try to walk us quickly through the other dimensions. In systemic change, we're thinking about, as I said, fundamental changes in terms of system structures and functions. And there are different aspects of that we know would be important. One of those relates to power and representation. And so in this case, we would recognize emerging change if there are effective mechanisms and capacities to meaningfully engage diverse stakeholders to shape policy and funding decisions that are related to climate resilient development. If that change, a signal of more advanced change in this area would be if those diverse voices are routinely heard and start to exert a strong level of influence on those decisions. Governance, policy, institutions is another important signal of systemic change. At an emerging level, this would be things like strengthened government capacities and collaboration mechanisms for climate resilient development, as well as approving climate resilient planning and policy. If signals are more advanced, we think we'd start to be seeing government institutions implementing and enforcing bold climate resilient development policies that address those underlying vulnerabilities and structural inequalities, policies that are comprehensive and difficult to circumvent. In the area of market and economic incentives, an emerging signal would be that those signals are established, that they start to induce business and policymakers to adopt just and climate resilient policies and practices. Also that inclusive access to financial resources for climate resilient development start to be increasingly available. Again, that signal would progress to be more advanced if government and financial actors and businesses start to use those policies and practices and financing to value climate change and start to provide consistent access to financing for these things. The next signal of systemic change relates to provisioning and welfare. And so provisioning services here, we're talking about fisheries and animal products and crops and timber and energy, all of these sorts of systems. Welfare here is a broad term, includes livelihoods and economic activity and food and housing security, health, all of these elements of human welfare. So the emerging signal here is that approaches or technologies are starting to demonstrate options for a transition toward more climate resilient and ecologically sustainable provisioning services that also contribute to human welfare. And we think that signal would be advanced if those approaches actually start to reduce underlying vulnerabilities, structural inequalities, if they're self-sustaining, if they can self-replicate. And lastly, systemic change can also refer to ecosystem integrity, forests, watersheds, et cetera. A signal of change here would be emerging if ecosystems are revitalized so that they can enhance their structures and functions and services for nature and people. If they can do all of that and also transform in response to disruptions and changing climates, that would be more advanced. Next slide. So speed has always been a bit of a tricky dimension for this community, but here we're trying to define 3 signals. One is around converging resources, basically meaning that concessional resources from multiple different sources are coming together in a way that can accelerate climate resilient policy and practice. The second is about meeting needs at speed. And this is really trying to reflect a balance between complexity and inclusivity and urgency, essentially a signal that progress is accelerating while you're also ensuring that you have appropriate inclusive engagement around complex or contested issues. The last one is a bit more concrete, basically that targets related to climate adaptation action are becoming more ambitious than they previously were. Next slide. On scale, our signals include scaling out, so expanding to more people or larger areas, as well as scaling up, for example, linking small scale local interventions with larger scale policies and processes. Another signal of scale is around financial scale. So here, an emerging signal would be an indication that public and private financing is being consistently and increasingly invested in climate resilient development. If that became more advanced, we would actually be seeing those financial flows starting to meet needs. And lastly, scale can be deepened. This sort of leads to a signal of shared understanding. So here, an emerging signal would be that government, businesses, and civil society, they're starting to develop a shared understanding for the need for this transformational change. That would be more advanced if that understanding becomes widely accepted, strongly shared, starts to drive decision-making. Next slide. The last dimension here is adaptive sustainability. And so the signals reflect some of the characteristics of resilience, like feedback loops, flexibility, dynamism, redundancy, as well as more sort of traditional ideas of durability. The first signal is that mechanisms are in place that can provide those feedback loops. They support flexibility and learning for climate resilient development. If that's more advanced, we would expect to be seeing long-term multi-sectoral planning and investment frameworks. They articulate that shared vision. They align competing priorities, or they manage those trade-offs, and they promote a flexible and dynamic approach. The second signal is around capacity, ownership, partnership, resources, basically saying that stakeholders and institutions, they own those interventions enough that they advance and they sustain the change, that they sustain their capacity, they generate resources, they have the right partnerships. And if those strategies and behaviors become internalized, they become the norm, capacity development is continual, climate information access and use are consistent, then that becomes more advanced. And finally, the last signal here is around vulnerability reduction and redundancy. So at an emerging stage, it would be that strategies are in place to avoid backsliding, enable recovery, have redundancies. And that's more advanced if those systems are adapted and resilient to climate shocks and stresses. There are those redundant backup systems, and they support resilience to longer term risk. All right, next slide. So to try to bring this back down to reality, we have a couple of examples here from the portfolio. In Zambia, for example, PPCR helped contribute to climate resilience being mainstreamed through national, sectoral, local strategic plans and regulatory frameworks. That's a signal of systemic change and governance and policy. In Mozambique, project partners have been using local successful piloting efforts to inform national policies and strategies. So that is a signal of governance and policy and systemic change in terms of changing and approving those national policies and strategies. It's also an example of systemic change in terms of provisioning and welfare, with increasing agricultural yields associated with this new approach to irrigation, for example. And it's an example of scaling up, connecting local scale demonstration with broader national policies and processes. There's a really nice example out of Jamaica that hits a lot of signals. In Jamaica, with PPCR support, the hydromet observation network has been significantly improved and expanded. It now covers 65% of the overall hydromet network with PPCR support, and it's provided the Caribbean's first real-time weather reporting system. So those are examples of scaling out. That's really contextually large changes in the context of Jamaica. There are also some fantastic signals of adaptive sustainability. Other development partners have seen this success. They're now procuring additional automated weather systems to expand this network. The government has recognized the value of this, and they have continued to expand the real-time data collection network with their own resources. They also have O&M for these resources as part of their national budgets. So that's capacity, ownership, partnership, resources. And there are also some indications that using all of these improved early warning systems have led to more timely use of the flood control gates. And so there haven't been any reports of rescue or disaster events, which is a nice signal of vulnerability reduction. All right, next slide.